Hi, Kevin Greene here. Welcome to Pathways to the Past. This is the very first of a series of videos I'm planning to do. It's going to explore the local history in and around Seymour, Indiana. The location for this first video is Crossroads Community Park, just across the tracks from downtown Seymour. Let me turn this around so I can show you. So the downtown business district is over there, and even down that way, and then we come back around. Sorry about going into the sun there. Even over in this way. But in 2018 they developed this from a parking lot into what we have today. The main feature is this amphitheater, this round grass sitting area in front of it. This is where the city has their City Jam concert series all through the summertime. I've chosen this area because of a unique role that this property played in the early development of Seymour. I've got a lot of things I want to go over with you, so let me find a seat and we'll get started. So if you've done any kind of research into the early history of Seymour, I'm sure you've heard of the name Meady Shields. Meady's considered the founder of Seymour. He's the one that laid it out on property that he owned and got us started. But the place where we are today, here where the park is, was not originally Shields' property. Indiana became a state in 1816, and they offered land for sale. There was a fellow named Samuel Moore that purchased this property about that time, and included what in today's Seymour would be from 2nd Street south to probably about Bruce Street. So a large portion of what is the downtown area today belonged to Samuel Moore. Now the Shields family, Meady's father was James Shields, and about the same time he brought his family, including a very young Meady, from East Tennessee, from a place called Shields Mountain there, which is incidentally not too far from where Dollywood is today. But he brought them up into southern Indiana. He was granted 1,200 acres of land here by the federal government, and it's said that that was for services that he gave during his time with the U.S. military. I haven't actually looked into that to do any research and figure it out, so I probably should do that someday. But in 1816 he brought his family up here and was given 1,200 acres. Now their land today would be from 7th Street and to the north, so it would include the old city cemetery and out toward what today is Riverview Cemetery. So by 1840 Meady was the lone inheritor of the property because his father, well, both of his parents had passed away. His only sibling had died, so he had inherited the 1,200 acres. But he didn't stop there. He kept adding to his property, buying up neighboring properties as they became available. So in 1850, Meady bought the property that the Moore family owned, which had been passed on to Samuel's son Joshua at that point. So that added to the properties that he owned, and that gave him basically all of the downtown business district of Seymour today, and a lot of the property that Seymour is on today, actually, at that point he owned. So 1850 was an interesting time, not only here but in the United States, because it was the early days of railroads in the United States. And I hope you understand how important it was for the railroads in the development of the United States. It was light years ahead in transportation as far as passengers and freight goods go as well. Getting a railroad to come to your town would make or break most towns. So it was about that time that it was announced that the first railroad we're going to talk about, which was the Jeffersonville and Indianapolis, was to be built. It's going to be built from Jeffersonville north to Indianapolis. And Meady probably had little doubts that railroad would be built across his property going north. So the way that would work is that the railroads would send out survey crews ahead of time to decide the best route for the railroads to take. About a year later, in 1851, it was announced that there was an east-west railroad that was going to be built. That would be the Ohio and Mississippi River. I'm sorry, I mean the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. It went from the Ohio River, or was going to go from the Ohio River at Cincinnati, across southern Indiana, across Illinois, and to the Mississippi River, and eventually across it to St. Louis. So survey crews were sent out to decide the route for the O&M Railroad, and most people in the area, I think, presumed that it would cross over about 2 miles north of here at a place called Rockford, because it was a thriving community with some industry and some housing, and about 500 people lived up there at the time. But Meade had other plans. He had in his mind that he wanted to start a town here, although he hadn't done anything about it yet, but it was in the plans. So Meade was able to meet with the chief civil engineer that was in charge of the survey crew that would decide where the O&M Railroad would be put out or laid out, and there seems to be 3 points that he made with him that convinced him to locate it in this area. The first thing was there was a need to build an elevated embankment to carry the railroad for about 3 miles from the downtown area to the west, because there was a fairly steep grade coming up into this area, plus the fact that it was real swampy all through the west of here at that time. The other thing is Meade told this fellow, who's, by the way, his last name happens to be Seymour, told him that he would give him large pieces of property in this area for them to use in any way that they needed to build their railroad things that they needed. And then the third thing was that he promised to, of course, name the town after Mr. Seymour, so that seemed to have sealed the deal. So the railroad was to be built across Meade's property here. So in April of 1852, Meade, just north of where we are right now, laid out on the ground where he wanted his new streets to go, and laid off about 10 blocks and about 100 lots that would be put up for sale eventually. The summer of that 1852, the J&I Railroad came through, and as he thought, crossed right over his property. I'm sure he had to, after the railroad was put through here, he probably had to readjust some of his lots and streets to fit, so I imagine that's why he didn't start selling property right away. But then it was November 11th, 1852, I've got my timeline cheat sheet here. That's the best way I can find to keep everything straight. But November the 11th, 1852, the lots went up for sale in the new town of Seymour. So that was going into the winter time, so honestly there wasn't a lot of activity that happened here until the spring of 1853. That's when most of the buildings started being built. So that was about the time that they started building the O&M Railroad from Cincinnati headed west. It actually took until June the 6th of 1854 for them to reach Seymour. And west of Seymour, there was work that was going on over in Illinois toward the Mississippi River, but there were 2 tunnels that had to be dug in west of Jackson County area, and those took a while. Actually, took almost 3 years. So from 1854 to 1857, Seymour was the end of the line for the O&M Railroad. It went from Cincinnati to Seymour, and that's an interesting situation because trains would come here, they would have to go back east to go back to Cincinnati because that's as far as they could go. They were still able to exchange freight and passengers with the north-south line, which was advantageous for everybody involved. So that made Seymour the perfect location for the O&M to build what they call their shops here. So that would consist of a roundhouse, turntable. The turntable would be where they could pull the locomotives onto to rotate them so that they could put them into the stalls of the roundhouse to be serviced. Steam locomotives were powerful and they were light years ahead of what they had before, the horsepower, but they required a huge amount of maintenance to keep them going. So they would have to have places where they could work on them, do repairs, clean out the fireboxes and that sort of thing. And so Seymour being the end of the line for 3 years, they immediately started building their shops here, and it was actually on this particular location that they did that. And actually the properties that Meade gave them was not only here, but if you go east of this location down to where today O'Brien Street is, all of that property along railroad tracks was given to the O&M to use as they needed. But most of the stuff was built right here where we are today. Now they had already built large shops at a place that they called Cochran, which was near Aurora, Indiana, and it was already going, and they had a huge 32 stall roundhouse there. So what exactly did the shops in the railroad area right here where we are look like? Well, the oldest map that I have is of the area is 1878. Let me get this down and I'll show you. So this is the 1878 map of this area where the railroad's O&M shops are. You can see up there in the top left corner the two railroad tracks crossing, which is right over there today, still in the same location. But you can see the original O&M station up here closer to the crossing to where most people remember it being later. And you can see the 9-stall brick roundhouse with the turntable in front of it there. That would have been where they would have pulled the locomotives in and then put them into the different stalls to service them. And it's interesting that that also shows some sort of a building to the north there coming off of the roundhouse that had evidently a building to pull maybe freight cars or possibly more locomotives into it to repair them. This is the only place I've ever seen that located. You can also see coming to the south end off of the roundhouse a building that we'll talk about later too. Here's a kind of a perspective map from 1886 that shows this area. You can kind of get a better idea of what the 9-stall roundhouse would have looked like. You can see the tracks still going to the north, but the building that they would have pulled into up there has been removed at this point. There's also a large coaling tower to the east here that existed on property that they had over there. This map is 1887 from the Sanborn fire insurance maps and shows a more accurate view of the roundhouse layout with what they're calling the machine shop behind it to the north, or to the south I mean, a blacksmith shop to the right of the machine shop, and a boiler house to the left. You can see the old depot up right by the crossing there at this point too. And this is a wonderful photo that I have that shows the 9-stall O&M roundhouse in the background, locomotive number 78 sitting on the turntable. Shows you the fancy brickwork that was involved in the layout of the roundhouse. This is a great photo. Another photo from about the same time period showing a group of railroad workers lined up next to the roundhouse in the background. You can see on the left side one of the ends of the roundhouse. It made not quite a full half circle around the turntable. So I don't know the exact date that roundhouse would have been built, but I'm sure they would have started on it not too long after the tracks reached Seymour, so I would say in the late 1850s for sure it was here. They would have needed it to service the locomotives and to rotate them to get them to head back the other direction. I'm looking at my timeline. 1857, the tracks were open to the Mississippi River. When the O&M Railroad was built, it was called a broad gauge. The standard gauge for railroads in the United States, which is the distance between the rails, is 4 feet 8 1/2 inches. But the O&M Railroad was built as a 6 foot wide gauge. They thought that would give it a smoother ride. But what it wound up doing is not letting them exchange freight cars with other railroads. So in 1871, that summer, they actually narrowed the gauge to standard gauge, and that was quite a feat in its own, and I should probably do a video about that someday. 1883, there was a new coal elevator listed as being built in Seymour. That would have been where they would have been able to put the coal into the steam locomotives to fuel them. Of course, they would have had water tanks here to fill them with water as well. December the 1st, 1886 is listed that the O&M shops in Seymour were closed. And workers that were here were moved to Vincennes. In the 1870s, I found a list that said there were shops listed in East St. Louis, Vincennes, Seymour, and Cochrane, which was the big one near Cincinnati. I'm not sure what was up with the workers, the shops being moved from Seymour. I think that the roundhouse was probably getting in difficult shape at that time, and I found a listing in 1887 saying that the turntable here was in bad shape. Now the turntables that would have been here, now this is the first roundhouse turntable that was in Seymour. We'll talk about the second one very shortly. But they would have been manually operated. They didn't have motors to turn them, so locomotive would pull onto it, and there would usually be 4 guys, 2 on each end on large handles that would push the locomotives around, rotate them to the direction that they needed to be. So in 1888 in Washington, Indiana, which is west of here, there was a new shops built, which was a huge facility. It was 70 acres. They built a roundhouse there, which had 35 stalls that made almost a full circle around the turntable. It was about that time that they tore down the 9-stall roundhouse and turntable that was located here in Seymour. When railroads didn't need things, they just got rid of them. They weren't really interested in preserving history. They had a business to run. But then in 1890, around that time, there's a new 5-stall roundhouse with a larger turntable that was constructed here. See, locomotives were getting larger all the time, so the turntables would become too small to fit the new locomotives, so they would have to build bigger ones. And that's what they did here. I can show you what that one looked like. So this is the new updated 1892 Sanborn insurance map. And you can see a few things different. You can see the new larger turntable there to the left side, with the smaller 5-stall roundhouse. Was still brick, but not nearly as fancy. And you can see the new station and baggage building built further east from the crossing, showing up in this one. Also notice that the roundhouse and turntable are gone, but what was called the machine shop is still standing and is now being referred to as a Ohio and Mississippi Railroad freight house. So this is what the O&M freight house looked like. It was originally built as a machine shop, became a freight house for the O&M, later the B&O, and the Pennsylvanians used it as well. But this was standing up until 1959, I believe it was. And this is the new 5-stall roundhouse that was built. Like I said, it's not nearly as fancy, still made of brick. You can see the Pennsylvania water tower behind it there. And this is the newly built in 1890 B&O. At that point it was still Ohio and Mississippi, but soon to become the B&O Southwestern Railroad. Passenger freight station, terminal, and a little baggage building. So back to my timeline. November of 1893, the B&O Southwestern bought out the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. July 13th, 1899, the B&O purchased the B&O Southwestern. Interesting incident happened about a month later in August of 1899. There was a 40,000 gallon water tank that they used to fill the locomotives near the roundhouse, and somehow a couple of passenger cars got pushed off the end of a siding into the water tank, which dumped over and spilled 40,000 gallons of water through the B&O shops, which would have been an interesting situation. And later in 1899, the B&O, after purchasing the railroad, they actually went through and reconfigured a lot of it to shorten it up and streamline things a little bit. In 1908, the turntable here at Seymour had become too small for the ever-growing locomotives that the B&O was using, so they tore it out and put in an 80-foot turntable to accommodate the larger locomotives. I think that's the same size that they had put in at Washington. They had also at this point had a roundhouse and some shops built over at North Vernon. In 1913, the North Vernon roundhouse burned down, but it was rebuilt. July of 1921, the B&O roundhouse and most of the operations here were moved to North Vernon. It was kind of controversial in the newspapers at the time, and there was lots of rumors that they would be eventually moving them back to Seymour or expanding to do something different here in Seymour, like maybe repair freight cars instead of locomotives and that sort of thing. But the B&O made sure or put an end to that, because in January of 1923, the five-stall roundhouse here was torn down. The turntable was taken out, but the pit remained for a long time. But at that point, there wasn't much that went on here at the on this property. And then we get into the late 1950s with the coming of the diesel locomotives, which greatly cut down on the maintenance that had to be performed on locomotives. So that did away with most of the rest of the roundhouses and shops across the state, including the North Vernon shops were abandoned in 1958. This property was basically not being used for much anymore. By 1959, the city of Seymour leased this property from the railroad. I think it was for $50 a year, something like that. And the plans were to turn this into a parking lot for the downtown area. In the late 50s and through the 70s, even when I remember it, the downtown Seymour Business District was the place to be. It was a happening place. There wasn't all the shops and things out along 50 like there are today. I'm sure parking was quite a problem at the time. So in doing that, in the October of 1960, and according to my notes, that's when the old freight house, the stone freight house, was torn down. According to the paper, the stones that were salvaged from that were used in other construction projects around the city. You know, some of it used as fill and that sort of thing. There could be some of it maybe in some places today, who knows? Be interesting. In December of 1961, there was a notification in the paper where the B&O Railroad went before the Seymour City Council to get approval to build a new station. I don't know if you've been around Seymour, you probably remember a metal building that was built closer to the where the two tracks cross over here. That was built in 1962 as the new freight passenger, not that there was much passenger service going at that time, and storage buildings. And then after they had it built, then that's when they tore down the other B&O station that was being used at the time. So a month or so back, maybe 2 months ago, I was wondering one Sunday afternoon exactly where especially the first big 9-stall roundhouse was located in this area here at the park. And so I printed off the Sanborn map from the 1887 map and brought it down here, and I found something kind of interesting. And to show you, I had Eric de Blasi do an aerial photo of the park today, and let me show you what I did with it. Okay, so I'm down at my shop to film this segment because I needed a computer. But here on the screen I've got an aerial view of the Crossroads Community Park as it is today. And then I overlaid it with the 1887 Sanborn map that shows the area as it was at that time with the roundhouse in place. And if you fade from one to the other, you can kind of see the location. The round grass circle there is in front of the amphitheater. And you can see that the roundhouse sat pretty close to where the amphitheater is today, just a little bit to the south of it. So while they were building this amphitheater, I came by here to see the progress, and I thought, you know, that looks like a roundhouse. I'm sure it was not intentional. It was probably just the way that most amphitheaters look, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine that as a roundhouse. So as you see, the roundhouse basically would have been sitting right about where that is, which I think is really cool. Probably just a little bit this side of it over here. So this big 9-stall roundhouse was sitting right there, and it's not hard to imagine this round grass circle as being a turntable, although it's much larger than what it would have been probably. So with the turntable and the roundhouse openings facing to the north, I'm standing about where this photo would have been taken back in the 1880s or 70s, whenever it was. So that's my first Pathways to the Past video. Hope you liked it. If you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe button so you'll get a notification when I decide to do some more. If you liked it, hit the like button, that'd be great. So until next time, thanks, see ya.